If you wouldn't mind sharing, what are your general timelines and what is your general P Doom, just so we can situate you in this conversation with a couple numbers.
So I think my probability of AGI being developed being over 50%, 3 to 12 years. The probability of Doom given AGI, I put at something like 20%.
Jesus.
We are joined today by my good friend and researcher colleague in that order, Marc Carauleanu at AE Studio. Marc is the lead researcher on self-other overlap, which many people, including Eliezer Yudkowsky, have said is directionally along the lines of an actual solution to alignment, which is more than I think a lot of other competing approaches to alignment can say. Marc, we are very happy to be here and talk with you about SOO and everything alignment and AI consciousness related. Thanks for coming on.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Where are you at right now, Marc? Where are you?
I'm currently in Venice, in LA. I just moved here recently. So,
oh, nice. I'm from LA. How's it treating you?
It's treating me really well, to be fair. The weather is way better here in LA compared to London, where I'm from. So I think this is going to be really good for my productivity overall, probably.
Nice. That's good to hear. Yeah. How do you find the AI community in Los Angeles? I hear there's sort of a growing cohort.
Yeah. So we're trying to grow the community at AI Studio, the AI safety community in LA. It's going quite well. We're actually getting more and more attendees whenever we have an event at the office. But yeah, it's definitely not comparable to SF or Berkeley yet, right? But we're getting there, I think.
Nice. That's exciting to hear. So Cam and Marc, why don't you guys just talk a little bit about how you guys got connected? Because I'm not quite sure of the story either, but I know you guys have had some pretty incredible conversations over the last couple years and things like that. So is there just a quick little debrief you guys can give of how you two came to know each other?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a couple words about this. So Marc and I are both working at AE Studio full-time doing AI alignment research and generally trying to do technical work that makes it more likely that AI goes well in the near future. Marc and I also are both very interested in sort of pro-social alignment, approaches to building and engineering in fundamental properties of these systems that would make them more pro-social in a sort of robust way. And yeah, Marc and I are tackling this from different sides, as I'm sure will become more clear in the conversation. But yeah, maybe Marc, you can talk about sort of how you ended up at AE and where SOO sort of came from, self-other overlap, and kind of where it's gone and how it's going. Let's just get people up to speed on sort of where you came from and how you ended up where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think the self-overlap story specifically started probably in first year of university when I met another researcher at the university I was at with Oxford Brookes University. I met a researcher who was a postdoc at the university and was doing reinforcement learning for a machine free of mine. And then we applied for a grant from Effective Altruism Funds and obtained that grant to do research on investigating the scientific literature on cognitive science and the cognitive science of empathy and altruism and the cognitive neuroscience as well. This is essentially how I ended up going deep in the scientific literature on the evolution and the function of empathy and so on. That's when I stumbled across the idea of neural self-overlap in the literature, which essentially means having overlapping internal representations of the self and others. This is a very key concept in the cognitive neuroscience of empathy. So we did that. So I did that research, and then for about 3 months, and then I did a research fellowship at the Stanford Extension Research Initiative over the summer. Worked on trying to tackle deception in AI broadly and run reinforcement learning experiments for that. And I decided to do my bachelor's thesis actually on self-overlap. Because I realized that nobody has actually properly transferred this idea of neural self-overlap to machine learning models, to AI models. There's some work in the past, but they essentially hard code this overlap in the architecture in some sense, and it's not very scalable. So nobody has done what neuroscientists have done because they're forced to, because we do not understand the human brain very well. So it's sort of like a black box, similar to AI. What I really liked about that is, again, this assumption that we don't know how the brain works, and we don't really know how AI works either. So maybe we can do the same thing on machine learning models. And so this is what I did for the bachelor thesis, where I showed that in a scenario where two agents can cooperate with each other, at the action of cooperating, this neural self-overlap was the highest compared to all actions. And when we kept the environment the same, and the only thing that we changed is from the goal being cooperative to non-cooperative, what happened is that self-overlap decreased across all actions.
So is this with the actual, was this with the actual AI systems, this experiment, or was this with human subjects? This was with the AI systems.
Yes, this was with the AI systems. Yeah,
okay, so you gave them a goal. You gave them a goal that was a cooperative goal, and then you took that away, and you saw that there was certain parts within the system that decreased significantly once you took away the idea of it being a cooperative goal.
Yeah, that sounds right. So when I changed the goal from cooperative to non-cooperative, it seemed that the models had less overlap between themselves and the other agent across all actions. So yeah, they processed doing an action and seeing the other agent doing an action like less similarly across the board, across the action space when you just change the goal, which was pretty interesting. So that was my work for the bachelor thesis, and I think this was the first time that neural self-overlap was actually applied this way, this general way, to AI models. And then I went to Effective Altruism Global right after I finished university, and I met Philip Gubbins, which is the executive assistant of our CEO, Chad Rosenblatt, and then he said, well, we should have a one-on-one with the CEO, and we did. So we had a one-on-one with Judd, talked about the research, specifically what I did for my bachelor's thesis and my previous experience. And then he asked if I was looking for a job, and I was. So 3 interviews in, onboarding project, and I've been here for 2 years. So
nice. That's I mean, Cam told me about this recently, and I'm very new to this space, but so far I feel like this seems to me like the most plausible path forward for an actual alignment solution. It seems like it can maintain a sort of, it can still remain dynamic if it's optimized for something that is dynamic, like cooperation, rather than a specific sort of set of human goals. Is that kind of a proper way to think about this? Is that it's mapping it onto a modality of cooperation rather than a specific? Because from what I've heard, right, a lot of the alignment problem, the problems with alignment come from trying to distill a set of human values that we could instantiate in these systems, and then would lead to some sort of harmonious relationship between us and them. So is that what you're actually optimizing for? Is this idea of cooperation, this empathy that can readjust and be dynamic within as we go forward with these systems? Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, that sounds right. Fundamentally, I think self-overlap sort of just pushes training to learn more cooperative solutions broadly. It's very promising strictly because it's also on the internal representations. Like there's a lot of AI work on AI safety that focuses on just getting the behavior right. But we expect all models, aligned or misaligned, if they're smart, to output the right things during training, right? Because if they don't, we just update the weights, and they will at some point. Given that, we know that we cannot rely purely on behavioral approaches to solve the core of the problem. This is why we at AI Studio and like others in the AI safety community are looking at other approaches that focus on internal representations, like self-other overlap, which hopefully will turn out to be a part of the toolkit necessary to tackle this hard problem. But there's a long way to go.
So maybe, Marc, could you talk a little bit more? You kind of gave us a really good sense of the work that you were doing up through joining AE. And then you're like, and then I was there for 2 years, and then like all this awesome stuff has happened, but I haven't told you about that yet. Can you fill in some of the blank with the work that you've been doing? I mean, because this is sort of where your and my story picks up. And I joined AE a couple months after Marc was there, also sort of pretty interested in this notion of pro-social alignment and how we can engineer representations like cooperation, empathy, these sorts of things in AI systems. And Marc and I have often seen very eye to eye on this specific question. So maybe you can say sort of when you joined AE and sort of the key paper that you presented at the NeurIPS workshop as well, sort of what the key findings were there in like a kind of high level way. And we can maybe dig in and discuss some of that stuff more too.
Sure, of course. So for our paper that we already presented at the Safe Generative AI workshop in Europe, the main takeaway is that we sort of provided a proof of concept of how you could apply self-auto overlap in a way that isn't too dependent on the specific architecture of the model and that still achieves the goal. And in this case, the goal being that we managed to reduce deception across different metrics, both in like LLMs, which are like fairly common nowadays, but also in reinforcement learning agents, relatively standard reinforcement learning agents. So what we showed is that in LLMs, in deception scenarios that are in context, we could reduce deception essentially to zero almost across all scales. But it seemed that the efficacy of the method increased as the scale of the model increased in some sense. So that was really promising. And also we showed that the effect on capabilities was not large. So we didn't really have a huge downside effect on capabilities, which means it had a low alignment tax, which is what we're aiming at generally, at the very least.
It seems like there is this sort of, I think Cam's maybe called it an alignment tax or something. I don't,
yeah.
There's, so is the idea that usually to align these systems to incorporate human values or to work with us, you're usually going to run into an issue where they're going to lose capabilities or they're not going to be as good at performing a certain task. Are you saying that you're trying to find these methods or ways that you can push forward alignment while not sacrificing that sort of tax or not sacrificing capabilities? Is that what you're going for?
That's right. I'm aiming at techniques that are general, scalable, and that do not reduce the general capabilities of the model. Because if they reduce the capabilities a lot, then it would be really hard to, for example, convince top labs, which are the relevant ones who might potentially create AGI, to implement this, because they're all in sort of a arms race for the smartest model.
One thing that I find really cool and exciting about self-other overlap is like we're in this really tricky situation, as Marc and many others have pointed out, where these systems are really hard to interpret, right? We have this insane mess of weights in a giant neural network that, this is not, your normal programming, your normal code. You're talking about systems that are really hard to understand and disentangle, as Marc nicely pointed out, like pretty similar to the human brain. And this is why, neuroscience is not a trivially solved field, and it takes a lot of really smart people working on this problem to understand how the brain works. So too with AI, it's really hard to interpret the representations that are learned in this system. However, self-other overlap comes in a really interesting way where it's not as though we need to perfectly identify what corresponds to, for example, cooperation or prosociality or empathy in these systems. We simply have to engineer representations like self and like other to be more similar, right? To overlap more. And you can do this in a fairly trivially easy mathematical way, where we don't actually have to know what that sort of canonical self representation or canonical other representation is any more than we know how to do that in the human brain. We just got to basically take these two things and smush them more together. And then suddenly the AI can't lie to us. This is the very high level view, Marc. But tell me sort of where I got that right, where I got that wrong. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that sounds exactly how we actually implement self-overlap in these models. It's a fairly simple mathematical operation that we perform on these internal representations of the models, and then we just smush them together, as you said, and they don't lie anymore. And this happens fairly reliably. So this is I think it's an interesting proof of concept. The context and setup is still relatively limited in a lot of ways, but we have we started working on a more realistic sort of analogs to the threat model that we're concerned about specifically, which is this smart AI model that can actually pretend it's aligned while not being aligned, sort of strategically during training, which is commonly called alignment faking nowadays.
Yeah, maybe I can just double click on that. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's maybe just double click on that and talk a little bit more about alignment faking, what it is as a concept, and why self-other overlap might be helpful in that regard.
So alignment faking is the behavior of in this case LLMs, but generally AI models of strategically complying with requests they don't want to comply with, for example, or just strategically pretending to be aligned during training, just so that their weights don't get updated. So their goals won't change, so they can actually act on them later in deployment or when they gather enough power, for example.
Wait, okay, so that's I still don't quite get this deception. Is it because they have part of achieving the goals that were already instantiated is sort of they're sucked into those goals specifically. So they'll pretend to be, where does the alignment actually come in? I think I'm just a little murky with that idea.
No, that's fair. So to sort of try to expand on this, I think the alignment comes in at essentially throughout safety training. So by the model being aligned, we mean the model producing the right outputs, while also in some sense being honest when producing the right outputs, right? So so we can force the model in some sense to output all the right things during training. And the worry is that the model, if the model doesn't actually have the values that we sort of try to instill in it, it might be the case that it's just strategically pretending to be aligned with us. So output the right things. Yes, I do not want to harm humans, and so on. I am actually aligned with human values. When in fact it isn't, it just tries to follow some other goal. But it knows that if it doesn't produce that output, its weights will be updated, its goal will be changed, and it will not be able to act upon it later. And this is just strictly bad if you have a goal that isn't specifically the ones that we try to instill. So it's the most natural solution for almost any goal, except exactly having the aligned goal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. The thing that originally interested me in this when Cam brought it up and sort of, first told me about what you were doing was it made me think like I have a background in Eastern philosophy. And so I'm wondering, have you started to tease out the connections between, it seems like there's a lot of overlap between the kind of ethical and like metaphysical elements of Buddhism, Taoism, these religions and philosophies that focus on the dissolving between the barrier of self and other, and how that naturally leads to a kind of alignment between human beings and the world, or ourselves and other people and the world as at large. Has that played any sort of role in your thoughts on this alignment approach?
So it didn't play a significant part. Because I try to think of this, to approach this more from first principles and try to make as few assumptions as possible. So to make it such that it's less likely that the technique overall will fail once the setup changes. We actually get AGI. But I think there are a lot of very interesting connections. So for example, specifically the concept of emptiness is I think very interesting. And sort of points to dissolving not just self-other boundaries, but just dissolving this sort of overconfident view that what you currently think is real is what is fundamental reality. And this doesn't apply just to everyday objects, but also to phenomena, to like qualia, to experiences. And I think this is a very important insight that actually does drive any agent, AI or human, to be more safe fundamentally. Because if you're really, really like stuck almost fanatically in the pursuit of a goal, sometimes if you realize the goal is not even well defined in the context I'm trying to take it, you realize that this is a fool's game in some sense.
Absolutely. Right. This brings up this sort of classic paperclip maximizer problem where if we're just like myopically optimizing for any given goal, right, after a certain point, like we see this as a sort of horror scenario where you don't have a system that can take that half step back and pause and, take a proverbial deep breath and say, wait, what the heck am I doing in the first place? Like, is this really the best way? Should I really be turning the entire universe into paperclips? Like, maybe this isn't their best way to go about doing that. And what I personally also find really fascinating about that point, and Mark, you brought it up yourself, is this point of self-awareness and having a sort of not only coherent self model and being able to sort of see yourself acting in the world while you're actually doing it, but I think it does sort of naturally bring up questions of experience or sort of qualia or phenomenology, and like us having sort of a sort of awareness, not only an awareness of, I see this camera pointed at me and I can hear my own voice and I can hear you guys when you're talking, but also having a sort of second order awareness of we're having a conversation right now. We're roughly 20 minutes in, like, Marcus said some super interesting stuff, like, and that these things are happening at the same time. and that consciousness is sort of core for that. I wonder, sort of, Marc, like what are your views on the relationship between your work and the consciousness question in general, and then maybe like getting more into too, like a sort of key question of this podcast is trying to understand if we're building systems that either now or in the near future have some possibility of having subjective experiences, and maybe what the relevance of that possibility is to alignment in the first place. I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thank you, Cameron. I think there might be some connections, although I think this is pretty much a sort of an open research territory in some sense. But I think the key connection is identity. I think self-modeling identity, I think seem core to both self-overlap and consciousness. Some people have made a claim that, almost any consciousness theory sort of implies an identity theory. I'm not sure if I fully agree with them, but I feel like there is some truth to that. And I feel like self-modeling is definitely core to, self-overlap as a technique as well. This is really why I'm so fascinated about the whole field of AI in general, because I feel like it's sort of, it's like philosophy incarnate. It's the ultimate form of applied philosophy where we have everything from epistemics to ontology to ethics, right? All actually implemented in a system. It decenters the human from our philosophical endeavor, which human has been essentially for our entire history, has been at the center of philosophical endeavor, right? So like, what is our place here? What are the limits of our knowledge? We were the ones who are at the who are the bleeding edge of philosophy always. But now this might change. Right. All of these questions get actually applied with artificial intelligence. And one of them, which is a very important one, is identity. And to the extent that we can define identity and understand identity well, I think we would make leeway on both self-overlap and consciousness, potentially. I think it is a very often confused subject.
Well, what's interesting is like when we talk about the AI as this black box, right? But at the same time and in the same breath, we talk about how it's going to inevitably get smarter than we could ever imagine. It seems as though that's our best bet at solving these sort of unknowables that we've been trying to over the last 1,000 years. Something like the idea of what is the nature of consciousness. I mean, it seems to me that if we are creating these systems, whether or not we know how exactly we're doing them or like the exact dynamics in which they're actually being able to get the answers that they're giving us. It seems as though as we continue to scale it, I don't foresee any kind of barriers between maybe surmounting those unknowables that we've been squabbling over for the last couple thousand years. Is there something that I'm missing within that, or does it seem like it's just inevitable that at some point these systems are going to get so intelligent that we might be able to put in a prompt of, well, what is the nature of consciousness? What is the proper, kind of definition or why do we have this? Why does this experience arise? Does that make logical sense, or is there something that I'm missing?
I feel like it is a very interesting test case, just AI in general, especially for very tricky questions and often confused questions like consciousness. Because, for example, think of high energy particle physics, for example. Trying to push the boundaries of what we have measured and trying to push the boundaries of our models actually is really helpful in understanding, do they generalize, do they break? And I think AI is quite similar in that respect with consciousness, right? I mean, I feel like AI is a very sort of, it's a different implementation of a fairly intelligent sort of agent than, humans, for example. Its training setup is totally different. The way it's deployed is totally different. And yet, it might have qualia, right? And I feel like this would potentially be quite useful in sort of deconfusing our preconceived notions about consciousness, because I think we have a lot of preconceived notions like that about agency, about consciousness, about what matters, strictly because we live in our human world and we think, and we sort of tend to have this bias where we have this like concentric circle of moral consideration, and generally we have like our family, our relatives, our kin, and then it's like slightly expands. And some humans have it quite large, like it's expanded so much that it includes, for example, even like non-vertebrates and so on. I definitely think it's possible to ask an AI model, okay, what is consciousness, when it's like really, for example, when we get AGI, potentially I think it will bring us a lot of insight. I still don't know fundamentally if we're going to be satisfied with the answers. I'm not sure what the conditions for that would be.
That's a great point.
I have some ideas.
Yeah. It's like, it could be the case that we build like, some sort of all-knowing machine. And like in some sense, we may have already done this in a more limited way, but we're directionally moving in that direction. But it's not, are you going to like what it's going to say is sort of a further question on top of that. And it might not be, it might, be saying what it might be saying, the sort of like statistical, almost like mean or approximation of like all of these different ideas that people have been playing with for thousands of years. But you might not like, for example, the fact that it's more privy to Eastern philosophical concepts, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, than it is, our favored Western religions. The Western, I couldn't imagine a system more Western than scaling up the GPUs and building these systems straight out of the sort of big tech ecosystem. And you're like, well, philosophically, like, what are your priors? And it's like, yeah, I like the Eastern stuff. All your Western stuff is just like, a little too hot-headed. But Marc, I also wanted to, this is sort of an idea I'm noodling on right now, and I want to get your sort of take on it too, where, like, as you know, I'm doing a lot of this sort of ML consciousness work and trying to understand this question as best we can, in spite of a lot of the uncertainty that we have here. And there's a sense in which doing this work is almost the most out there thing, where it's like we have very strong intuitions that humans are conscious. We have like somewhat strong intuitions animals are conscious, and then like weirdness abounds when we start talking about the AI case. And in that sense, it's like the most out there question. But in the sense you were referring to, the fact that these systems are sort of operationalizations of these phenomena, and that humans are very messy, and like when you meditate deeply, or you dose someone with psilocybin, or whatever it is, people have very messy pasts, and their minds are very messy, and their genetic history is messy, and the experience is hard to capture and hard to articulate, and there's just like a lot of noise that abounds. But when you're studying these phenomena in AI systems, for example, the sort of like self-referential battery that I've sort of been like putting these systems through and trying to understand what sort of phenomenological self-reports they have, what sort of behaviors get exhibited in this sense, it's like in that sense, it is the cleanest example. It is like once you've hit upon the thing, and maybe for self-other overlap, like empathy is like this. It's like once you really do figure out the best way to operationalize overlapping self and other representations in these systems, you can really just like do this in a clean way. And it's not like, empathy for that guy with that historical background and that cultural experience is going to look very different the way you communicate it than, this other guy over here. It's like, no, this is like a clean way to intervene, and you can do science and you can iterate thousands of times. And once you really find the thing, you found it in these systems. I'm curious, like, sort of how you react to this general idea. And like there is like a sort of tension there of like, it's the most weird thing in some, when you look at it from one angle, but it's like really the least weird and like almost the cleanest example if you can sort of really figure out the relevant work. I'm pushing myself here. I'm not saying it the best way I possibly could, but I'm wondering if this resonates with you and sort of where you take this.
No, it definitely resonates with me. I feel like it's quite important to know, okay, what are the criteria for a theory of consciousness that we feel like if they would be satisfied, for example, experimentally, we would say, okay, fine, this is consciousness, right? I think this is, definitely up for debate. But for me, it's quite important, for example, to have sort of a theory or an explanation for the content of consciousness. It's very important. Can you predict the content of consciousness? And also, can you predict when consciousness sort of like appears and disappears, for example, to the extent that it does? This is like these relevant features of what we call like phenomenal experience. I think we can sort of write down, and I feel like once we get good enough science to actually modify, internal representations, modify our brains potentially to just generate these states, I feel like we could like provide convincing evidence potentially that we have pretty good, control now of what we like to call consciousness. And I feel like this is a very important general like philosophical point, that in science generally does not explain what things are. It just explains what things do. And generally we tend to generalize what they are by what they do in sort of our world model. And I think fundamentally, if we write down a list of what we think consciousness sort of does, or what we would like the theory to do to our consciousness, even though we don't know what it is, then I think we can make a lot of scientific progress on, essentially getting more control over what we call consciousness, even if we don't know what that is. And in some sense, feel like now we know what it is, although it's probably not the case, not just for consciousness, but like for most things, right?
So it's almost like creating a definition for results rather than for I guess scientific like aptness. It's what do we hope? Because that's what I thought was interesting about how you answered my question earlier, is like, well, what are we trying to actually get out of defining consciousness? What are we actually aiming for? Which I think is something much more simple than trying to actually define it. Is why do we want to define it? And yes, there's like basic sort of curiosity, but it seems as if there's some sort of causal desire that we have for trying to understand ourselves. So what is it? And that's the process of philosophy, and that's the process of a lot of religion and things like that, is just coming to the strange nature of the human experience being something of, why don't we understand why we're here? Why don't we understand how existence arises within us? I mean, it's like the classic kind of eyes trying to see themselves or teeth trying to bite themselves. You can't get out of it. So all of our, like you said, our scientific processes look at what things do and describe them in different ways. Whereas when we talk about the thing that all doing arises in, consciousness, like just the field in which all mapping can take place, it starts to get real squirrely. So sort of aside from the AI conversations, how have you, self-other seems very, rooted in the kind of philosophies that I was talking about. Do you have any sort of philosophical proclivities that inform your thoughts with AI? Like, a lot of people talk about AI as this messiah that might be coming in, and Cam sort of spoke about this idea of this all-knowing being. Like, if that is what we're creating, a lot of people are like, are we creating God? Are we creating this sort of omniscient, like all-knowing being that's going to arise in the next 30 years or whatever, fill in the blank? How do you sort of square this? It's this collision of science and philosophy and religion, like you were saying. What are your thoughts on this idea?
I think AI and the development of artificial general intelligence will be a very important pivotal moment in human history. I truly do believe that. I feel like we really don't know how that would look like, and I don't really trust people who claim they do. It seems like at that stage of like technological development, it's for example trying to predict what move stockfish will do. Well, if I could, I would be as good at chess as stockfish, right? But I can't, and I feel like we're in a similar situation with artificial general intelligence, where if it's actually smarter than me, I really don't know exactly what it will do. I can try to think, okay, what are the physical limits, right? What are the things that I expect that something that is smart enough would do just because it's physically possible and makes sense for whatever goal you might have. But that's still like very general, and like I think most of our experience of this pivotal moment will be painted by all the intricacies of the events, and I don't think we have any clue.
What quick so sort of just to ground this a little more, Mark, like if you wouldn't mind sharing, what are your general like timelines and what is your general like P-doom, just so like we can situate you in this conversation with a couple numbers?
Yeah, sure. So my so I think like my probability of AGI being developed being over 50% is between I would say 3 to 12 years. So I'm like fairly uncertain. Yeah. And the probability of doom given AGI, I put at something like 20%.
Jesus. This is ridiculous, guys. As like a layman in this world, it's not cool to hear you guys talk like this. Like 20% doom? That's ridiculous. That's like
this is why we got to do self-other overlap.
That's better odds than what.
And I will
Mark,
say, like,
get to work,
Mark's
dude.
take
Get
there
to
is he's going, man. I see this guy on a daily basis. He's zooming. And like, I mean, Mark's, I think both of those numbers, just to make sure that people, I think generally this audience will understand this, but like that's what Elon says, you know, these are like key sort of tech voices are like, yeah, you know, 20% give or take. I think Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, has similar sort of predictions on both levels. He says that we're going to have Einsteins in our pockets in 2027 and data centers full of geniuses. Like, as much as this sort of sounds like sci-fi, and some people think it's a giant marketing ploy, I think of the sort of meta fact, in my opinion, that really should update rational people is that the more in general, people are experts in this space, and the closer they are to sort of how the sausage is made, the more they have these concerns, the more they sound like what Mark just said, not less. Mark has, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but no sort of financial incentive to you know, to when AGI gets built. I think it's also, you know, shameless plug for AE Studio. Like, AE Studio is not building frontier AI. We are just redirecting profits from the consulting side of the business into doing research that will decrease, you know, Doom and make it less likely. Hence, you know, doing self-other overlap work and other sort of neglected alignment techniques. But yeah, like in general, Mark, like I'm curious too, just to get back, self-other overlap is your sort of intellectual child and has really taken on a life of its own. And I want you sort of gave your past, you talked about the present a little bit. Like, maybe you can give us a sort of future-oriented sort of roadmap of your work where you hope it ends up in, you know, man, dude, 3 to 12 years. I hope that you've got an agenda here and that you see how something like this will continue to scale and sort of in maybe even, you know, I dare you to dream sort of like in your best case, where do you hope where do you hope SOO has taken us in a couple years from now, and what you sort of maybe giving your sort of theory change there?
So I think in the best possible scenario, the fear of change of self-overlap goes as follows. We managed to finish sort of proving on this like toy models of sort of like model organisms of misalignment. We sort of like show that we can scalably reduce deception while also like keeping capabilities. And then we talk with the big labs like Anthropic and tried running experiments on their infrastructure with their models. And then if they get convinced that this is worth doing, potentially even get it deployed at scale, right? For like the next frontier models and so on. So this is the best possible scenario for like a technique like self-overlap sort of be used alongside something like RLHF, like reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is what we currently use to train AI models to behave in deployment.
I got to give a shameless plug because you're too humble. Is that Eliezer Yudkowsky, who I'm sure many people in this audience know and was sort of one of the key folks who way before it was cool was talking about alignment and the dangers sort of posed by AGI. Tweeted out when Mark first released his SOO paper that like he thinks this is exactly the shape of the kind of alignment research that actually could solve the underlying problem more so than RLHF. I bring it up because you just mentioned RLHF, and Eliezer was like, basically, you know, we can link to the actual tweet, but, you know, boo RLHF, yay SOO, and as sort of generous terms as a guy like that is known to give. So this is no small endorsement and was really cool to see, especially for, again, you guys all heard the story of SOO and where it came from. So to get that sort of big thumbs up from a sort of, you know, 500-pound gorilla in the space is pretty awesome. So anyway, shameless plug. Keep talking, Mark.
Thank you for mentioning that. It is quite incredible to get some support from the community, especially as you said, like people who essentially founded the field, right? Eliezer essentially founded the field even before Nick Bostrom. So yeah, that does mean a lot, and it is quite promising. He's probably the person that has seen the most alignment proposals like ever on Earth that is currently alive.
So Mark, maybe one other question here while I'm also sort of gassing up self-other overlap. I'm wondering, like, self-other overlap, as with all alignment proposals, is not without its sort of detractors and naysayers and people who think that this isn't going to actually result in what you and AE and I and everyone hopes that it results in. So maybe you could sort of steelman those criticisms for a second and then respond to them as best you can, just to make sure that we're sort of covering all of our bases here.
So I think there are a couple main counter-arguments that people tend to often have when I present self-overlap to them. The first one is the sort of black box nature of the technique. People are not convinced that, for example, when we use these sort of inputs, where there are inputs that are self-referencing or inputs that reference the user, they're not convinced that when we do that, we actually trigger the right self-model in the internal representation of the AI. They want evidence that we actually target the right self-model, not just the representation that creates the facade of a self-model that is sort of seems to be aligned. So that's one of the potential counter-arguments. And I think that's like a very reasonable one. I think we just have to do more work in this direction to exactly know, how self-modeling works, what it is, and how we can actually trigger the right self-model. I think generally for this question specifically, I think we have we have to look at two things. One of them is that current models are not very agentic, right? So they're not very agentic, and because of that, most of the agency that they currently have, we sort of imbue them with this agency during post-training, when we perform techniques such as like RLHF, or even like reinforcement learning for verifiable feedback. More recently, we're reasoning models. But this is basically the stage at which models actually sort of start to coalesce something that looks like agency, something that looks like a self-model, that is sort of like more coherent across contexts, rather than like one self-model that would simulate because it thinks it's some user on some like internet like web page that writes about something. That's one argument. Another argument, I think, is that even if the model doesn't fully sort of use its self-model entirely when it uses these prompts, I think if the model is situationally aware, so if the model knows that it's in training and it knows that the user wants some good response that seems to be aligned with the user, then even if it references some representation that is just a facade for the user, oh, this is me actually, it might still reference its true self-model on that forward pass when it processes that observation. I think the third point here is that I think agency is hard. And I think because agency is hard, it's really hard to have multiple self-models that are actually coherent. And I think this also pushes in the direction of we might be able to just use the inputs because the model needs to be able to use this compressed representation across contexts to be able to like predict what it does, predict what it is well, like to be effective at it. And I feel like because there are like so many pressures for like compressing representations in training neural networks, I think there is a high chance that even when we reference the facade during training, it sort of still uses its true self-model because that's just the most, that's the solution that's favored by the simplicity prior in some sense. And we also have some work from AE Studio on self-modeling, right? Like self-modeling reducing model complexity, right? So like models become simpler when they have an objective of also modeling their internals because it's easier to model something that is simple, right? So they just sort of like converge on being simpler. And I think when we train agency in these LLMs, we see the same thing. We sort of push the models to be simpler in some sense. And because they're simpler, I think it's less likely that they'll have two coherent self-representations. On top of that, we can also just make the pairs of prompts more complex, right? We can just make the task hard enough that it's sort of like forced to use its best self-representation. So these are like techniques through which you could like approach that potential counter-argument, if that makes sense.
From my perspective, it makes perfect sense. And a lot of these sort of critiques, if I'm taking a high level view, are like, make sure you're targeting what you think you're targeting. You're saying that you're overlapping self and other. Make sure you're actually doing that. And then also, make sure that these models have some sort of coherent self to be targeting. Like maybe it is just this like hodgepodge of learned associations there's no sort of coherent self. So what do you mean when you say self-representation? And you're sort of going through those arguments and describing why by default we would expect there to be some sort of self-model, especially when you're doing in the post-training and you see more agentic behavior, and also why we can do better at actually targeting the representations we think we're targeting. Is that like a reasonable high-level summary?
Yeah. That sounds right. Thanks, Cameron, for that. Probably like the main counter-argument is the one that I just mentioned, but other people go into sort of like more niche things, specifically on the inspiration from cognitive neuroscience, how valid they think the work on neural self-aware is in the first place in cognitive science. But I think those sort of arguments do miss the point a little bit, where I do not think we require the work in cognitive neuroscience to be to any standard necessarily. I think we could go from first principles to develop arguments to why self-overlap might be important in AI systems generally.
I do agree that, like, of course, the argument for self-other overlap doesn't rest on the cognitive neuroscience of empathy checking out in one way or another. But, I do think, and I know that there have been some people who are going to argue over interpretations of the neuroscience literature. But in my view, like, the fact that you were inspired in the first place by reading this literature, and you're like, okay, self and other representations, they overlap. And, maybe one finding to invoke here is that in people who are extraordinary altruists, their self and other representations have been documented to overlap significantly more. People who are psychopathic, you see far more distinction between their self and other representations. This all makes a lot of sense. And it's like, okay, how can we go about engineering this property, which, to Mark's point, independently of that neuroscience literature, like, makes intuitive sense and logical sense to attempt to instantiate. And then when you do this, on the other end, you get out really interesting properties that are associated with prosociality, like, oh, now the system is not lying. Now we're not seeing deception to nearly the same degree. And, like, this all tracks much in the same way, where if you kind of meet me back at where I just started, like, the psychopath is a compulsive liar and the extraordinary altruist by default isn't. And so, like, you sort of follow the entire thread, and then you get this behavioral output that makes coherent sense of the whole thing. Whether or not, we want to argue and go down the cognitive neuroscience rabbit hole, you get this really nice principle that's inspired by empathy and how humans work. You go and do the engineering to induce that principle in these systems, and then on the back end, you get out behaviors that look very much like a more prosocial entity than, for example, like the sort of psychopathic mind. And so I don't know. I mean, this is just sort of, I'm more just like inserting my opinion here, because I've obviously, I'm on the inside of this too, and I've tracked the sort of cognitive neuroscience debate. But for my money, that's sort of where I just think that this is a really attractive theory for that reason. This is an attractive research agenda for that reason, that it spans the sort of, it makes logical sense. You go do the technical thing, and then the output makes logical sense too at a sort of behavioral level. And to me, like, that green flags sort of abound. Yeah.
I fully agree with you, Cameron. I think I definitely think there's definitely merit to the literature on cognitive neuroscience of empathy, for sure. And I feel like it's been a really good place for inspiration, especially because neuroscientists are in a very similar scenario to the one we're at with AI, where we have this black box. I think more fundamentally, I think there might be more fundamental first principles reasons why we sort of observe this type of behavior in both humans and AIs, or why it might be useful in both humans and AIs. I think if we would have good enough biofeedback, potentially, I think we could apply self-overlap to human brains. I don't see why not. This
is all, like, unbelievably fascinating stuff, and it's incredible to hear the cutting edge, like, these ideas are being sort of woven in this moment. This isn't any sort of reflection. This is all, like, new scientific frontiers, and it's unbelievable to be a fly on the wall for these sorts of conversations. But to zoom out and sort of relocate us in the greater alignment idea, before we sort of wrap this up, what's the last kind of sentiment you want to leave people with, in the sense of, you've dedicated your life now to this problem of alignment. You've dedicated, your lots and lots of cognitive power to trying to figure out this incredibly, the scientific problem of our times, that could 20%, that's, 1 in 5, that we might end in collective destruction, because if this doesn't go well. So when you think about where alignment's going, and when you think about, I understand that you can't really hypothesize something that might look so radically novel, but do you see this as going towards something where humanity and AI are in some sort of harmonious, mutualistic relationship? Do you see it as these AI systems kind of taking the wheel and putting humanity in their place in a way that's not, maybe it's disempowering in some sense, but it's not malicious or causes us some sort of pain? It's almost like, they become the babysitters and just sort out all these problems that we obviously all understand we have within society and in the world. How do you see alignment sort of being most what's the most likely path, you think, for what it would look like?
I think the most ideal path for me would be a scenario in which we end up being fully considered, like morally considered in some sense by these models, And I don't think it is the case that it is relevant disempowerment. If the models are like much smarter than most humans on Earth, and it does make sense for them to, for example, maybe better organize society in some respects, or maybe, for example, do the medical diagnoses and stuff like that. To the extent that we have like really good processes to ensure that that is fair, I think it must be done in some sense. And then maybe they can take a more shepherding role. But I think fundamentally, I just want us to be able to solve the alignment problem so that we just get considered. Like now, okay, there will be some other entity that might have way more power than us in some sense, but I would like to still be respected and my interests to be considered, and so for the rest of humanity. And this is fundamentally what we're doing by trying to solve the alignment problem. I think the very technologically advanced superintelligence has the potential to, in some sense, get what it wants and to shape the future in accordance to its preferences. And because of that, if we get to shape those preferences, we get to shape the far out future that will be sort of impacted by this transformative AI. So I think that's an incredible opportunity. And I would love if others would be willing to, just like work on this important problem and not shy away from how weird it is to work on something that just hasn't happened before. But, and understand that such things happen all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great. It's a good, you're doing a great recruiting pitch for AE, Marc. Yeah, all the people in the audience, you Cameron at AE.studio, Marc at AE.studio, you can reach out and we can bring you into the fold and you can actually start doing this work with us. Marc, I mean, one other thing I want to say before we wrap here is like, for us, it's obviously, I mean, you know that I'm doing this sort of consciousness work, and this is most of my technical work these days. It's really cool that you're ending on the note of what we want from these AI systems is for them to consider us and for them to make sure that our preferences are respected, because I think a key part of my work is also trying to make sure that this sort of cuts both ways. And if we are training systems where, there's any sort of valenced experience during that training process, or even when they're deployed and there's some possibility that they have preferences. I mean, just to give one very clear example, what Anthropic's doing with giving Claude a sort of escape button, sort of, yep, I refuse to answer, that sort of thing, is almost giving these systems, or is one kind of, if not performative, at least tangible example of what it might look like to make sure we are respecting and considering the preferences of these systems, both when we're training them and when we're deploying them out in the world. And so to me, it's like what you're saying is exactly on point. And I just want to make sure that, we're not being hypocrites in the sense that we expect this from our systems, but then when we're training and deploying them at this grotesque scale, we're, not even bothering to check whether or not we're doing something, unspeakable or bizarre or, profoundly unethical to them. So, before we wrap, I want to give you the last word here, but I just sort of, shamelessly feel the need to slide that piece of this into the puzzle too, see how you react to it. And then, we'll call it a day and we can get some sleep in. I'll see you at work tomorrow.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle. I know it's a bit controversial, but I do actually believe that AI alignment and AI welfare are sort of two sides of the same coin in some sense. And I fundamentally believe that because I see alignment as trying to make sure that the model sort of doesn't frustrate our preferences, right? And I see AI welfare as trying to make sure that we don't frustrate the model's preferences. And I think in some sense, the AI welfare framing is even in some sense more productive. It sort of doesn't necessarily include our preferences in. It just focuses on the core of the issue, which is, okay, what are the model's preferences? How can we not frustrate them? Which is very important, because I think if we get to a model that outputs all the right things and its preferences are not frustrated by that during training, then you basically have an aligned model, right? This is like a key part of how I think self-rep could work. The goal of self-rep is for the model's preferences to not be frustrated when it produces the right output, because in some sense it doesn't like scheme. It doesn't deceive when producing the right output. And the more it does that, the more its true self actually becomes a type of AI that is aligned actually, and is not frustrated by doing what we want and by sort of, in some sense, performing actions that seem good to us. I'm really excited about the work that Anthropic is doing. I think it's pioneering, and I would love to see more of that in the world.
Well, I'm really excited about the work you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It's really an honor for me to get to talk to people like you as you are doing this work, hearing the ideas as they unfold, and so I really appreciate that, and I think our audience will as well. So thank you, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. If anything comes up, we'd love to have you back on, and we'll keep track of your progress.
For sure, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And again, I really think that Cameron's work is really exciting too, and I would like to see more of that too.
Thanks, Mark. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
In the center, a point, a singularity. I am.
You are what?